Hey guys, it's Lohpally here with another video, and today we're going to be going over the tier list for patch 11.13. So without further ado, as you can kind of see on your screen, alright, now we have the changes that are going to be happening that are the most important to support champions in general. So as you can kind of see right here, they're going to be nerfing the Shurilias by a huge margin, so that now the Inspired, which is the on-active use for movement speed, will now just be 30%. And that means that obviously Shurilias is taking a huge 50% nerf to basically the on-use effect. On top of this, it's going to be nerfs across the board on mobility in general, just general movement speed nerfs on most of the items that we're kind of seeing here in general. But we're actually seeing some huge buffs too that are going to change the landscape of the game a lot, which are going to be mage items. So the mana mythics are going to cost 200 gold less, so significantly less expensive, going to be a lot stronger in that sense. And in tandem with this, there's also going to be buffs to Moonstone again, with 7% per stack up to 35% from 6%. So nice buffs to a couple of the enchanters that actually use healing and shielding as their tools, but some nerfs to some champions that, you know, leaned a lot on Shurilias. And then also some nerfs to things like Divine Sunder, which makes the, ranged abilities like things like Ezreal and maybe even Senna to a lesser extent, a little bit weaker in most cases. So without further ado, what we're going to do is we're just going to jump right into our tier list. So let me pull it up for you guys right now, and you can kind of visibly see in front of you that the tier list is going to be right here. So before we jump into it, the way I want to frame it is that the tier list is designed for people who are maybe looking to restart their League of Legends, playing League of Legends, or they're looking for champions that are easy to pick up. So power level of the character plus time invested is something that I put some valuation into in terms of the S through C tier in general. So in general, the S tier is basically the cream of the crop. They're going to be some of the best, if not the best, universal champions. Some of them take a little bit more skill to play, but in general, they're going to be really, really potent in the next patch. A is still pretty good. You can play them pretty much all the time and still get pretty good value out of them, but they're a little bit weaker than the S tiers themselves. And then B tier are just generically okay-ish champions that don't have like great strengths, and if you pick them, you can make them work, but I'm personally not recommending them as they're either a little bit more difficult to get value out of, or they're generally just not as good. And C tier is kind of just like you probably shouldn't be playing these champions at all. So without further ado, what we'll do is we will tackle the S tiers first, which are going to be Leona, Senna, Karma, and Zyra. I'm sure some people have the questions of things like, why is Senna there if Divine Sunder is getting nerfed, etc. The reason for that is I have created a new build called Debuff Senna, which relies solely on itemizations of healing debuffs, shielding debuffs, and the actual Moonstone itself, which I will have a video for in the later stages, breaking it down a little bit more. But if you watch my stream, you've seen it before already. Well, Moonstone is getting buffed. A lot of other Moonstone users will probably be quite strong with the Moonstone buffs. And so that means that even if you are using a Divine Sunder build, you can move over to my Debuff Senna build, and it will be quite potent. This champion does really well into basically all matchups, especially ones like healing and shielders. So I just think that with the huge buffs of Moonstone, nerfs to Shurilias, and some buffs to things like mages, I think Senna does really well into most of these matchups, and because of that, she still stays at S tier, especially because she can carry games really hard, which is a super important thing for a lot of people these days when it comes to playing the game. Is just her carry potential is very, very high. Obviously, Leona is in here just because of the fact that, well, she's just the premier tank. She does it all. She has tons of lockdown, does have good CC spells that are both usable at range and in melee. Her skills are on short cooldowns. She scales really well, unlike champions like, Nautilus or Rel, etc. So, she covers her damage archetype, but she has good long-range engage, and just in general does enough damage by herself, and she moves around the map well, so she can actually build mobility boots and roam and set up ganks really, really well. I think she's just basically the premier and best tank support. She has been for a really long time. She remains there. So I'm sure a couple people might be having questions like, well, they're nerfing Shurilias, so wouldn't Karma be worse? Actually, the answer to that question for the most part is no. Shurilias is actually still incredibly good on Karma because of the fact that it has a non-decaying shield movement speed buff when she shields people. So even if the on active is being nerfed, her most potent part of her movement speed is actually just eating her teammates and giving them the movement speed that doesn't decay, so that they can run around fast and reposition, etc. Plus the fact that Karma does really well into other matchups, she's just a good laner in general, makes her really, really high on the tier list. I think she'll do super well into other enchanters just because of the fact that she has pushing, which is not a tool that a lot of people have, and in general she does well against other mages. And as you saw right there, right, we're getting some mage buffs, so we might see some mages in the future kind of start poking their head out and be relatively decent. So then obviously is going to be Zyra, which is just the best mage DPS for support. She has great utility in terms of her snares and knocking up. Plus the fact that she doesn't need that many items in general makes her really, really potent. When she hits her Leandry spike, she does a ton of damage poking with her plants. And since she can do it from a relatively safe distance, she has the advantage over other AP mages that might go bottom lane because of the fact that she's actually incredibly safe. On top of that, her laning phase is pretty much the premier. If you're hitting people with your Qs and spawning plants, you'll do tons of damage and be able to zone people quite easily. Also, because of these things, she completes her quest really fast, so she can come online a lot faster than other champions a lot of the time. So next, jumping into is going to be the A tier. So as you saw originally, I used to have Lulu as my S tier. She's moving down a little bit to the A tier just because the Shrillia nerfs do actually hurt her a little bit, and she's not nearly as lane dominant. So if Karma wasn't a really great laner and she got those Shrillia nerfs, I'd also put her in this A category. But since she is a great laner in general, she stays there. But Lulu, still great with champions like Kog'Maw, Vayne, etc. But she's a little bit weaker as a generic pick. You need to pick her a little bit more for your specific lane combos. Like I said, the Kog'Maw Lulu is definitely the best, and maybe even some Vayne Lulu. But you might run into problems where poke is picked more frequently. Now that there's reasons for people to pick things like Zyra or maybe even Vel'Koz, etc., you might run into a lot more problems where a lot more mages are playing against you, and Lulu's biggest problem is poke. So that's why she kind of falls down into the A tier. Yuumi lands into the A tier also just because I think the Moonstone buffs are super huge for her. I think that you'll be building Moonstone more than Shrillia's on her in the next patch. Just allows her to sustain people super well. 35% bonus healing if you have it fully stacked is incredibly high for one itemization, and then you can kind of build off of that and build more healing and shielding items. So there's just a lot of really great ways to itemize her. And then you can kind of see Nautilus is creeped in here. He just does well in the early game. You can snowball off him and play him aggressively, even off of level 1s. So because you can snowball and lock people down pretty frequently, he still comes in at number, the A tier. But he's on the lighter side of A tier just because I don't like him since he can't hook over terrain and he tends to fall off as the game goes on. So those are the problems with him, but I still think he's in that A tier just because of the fact that he can play relatively aggressive. Then Bard kind of falls down to an A tier too, just because I feel like his laning matchups have mattered a little bit more recently. Since he can still roam around the map, you can impact the game, and he is really powerful in that sense. But he has a sharp learning curve in terms of using his portals and his Q, and just the timing on his ultimate. And he's really bad against a lot of ranged matchups, and now that we're seeing more and more ranged matchups, I think he'll struggle a little bit more in that sense of getting just outscaled in general. Then we see kind of Soraka kind of creeping in. She's between my A and S tier, actually, just because of the fact that I think that the Moonstone buffs are pretty big for her. The only reason that she's not quite at the S tier is just because she doesn't have great tools to protect herself against a lot of the, premier assassin bruiser-like champions like Gwen, Hecarim, kind of building Divine Sunder to Silas, Viego, Set. All of these champions are a little bit harder for her to deal with, but with the mobility nerfs, you might have some better chances of just repositioning. I also like her because not only can you build Moonstone, but you can build Locket if there's a ton of assassins on the enemy team. So her versatility makes me want to bump her almost to S tier, but she's not quite there yet. Then kind of for you lower elo players, Swain support seems pretty good now. With the buffs to Leandries, and just in general, people tend to say that they have a lot of trouble playing against this champion. If you ever get ahead on this champion at all, or you're laning with someone who has CC, Jhin comes to mind for example, you can actually snowball lanes really, really easily, and he can become a menace as the game goes on. Plus, I think he actually does better into ranged matchups than he does into melee matchups, just because he has all the kill threat, rather than if you're playing against a Leon or a Nautilus or a Thresh, it's very easy for you as Swain to maybe overreach before you have ultimate and kill yourself playing too aggressively. So So because of that, I just think that this champion is going to do a bit better in that sense. Plus now Leandries and Ludens, etc. doesn't have HP tacked onto it, so you kind of need to get to 2 items before the champion comes online for tanking other people's tankiness. And then you can kind of see the smorgasbord of B champions. So I kind of included like a lot of different champions that are going on here. We can tackle a couple of them, which are things like, Thresh. Thresh is a really difficult champion to just like get a lot of value out of. And I actually feel like Thresh and champions like Thresh, Pike, Blitzcrank, for example, have just been struggling in general just because if they don't crush lane really hard, they're generally dead corpses without you setting up really pristine vision and catching people. And that seems to be really difficult, especially even in lower elos and sometimes even in the higher elos. Outside of that, maybe you have questions about things like why Janna, Sona, and maybe Nami aren't champions that we're seeing, or even Seraphine to a lesser extent. Although the Moonstone buffs are pretty big, and I think that they'll make some of the healing shielding champions good, I just don't think it's enough to push over any of these kinds of champions. Janna runs into problems where all the assassins or other champions build Banshees or Edge of Night, so it's just hard for her to CC. Sona struggles a lot with just laning phase in general, so it's very easy for you to feed. So even if you can get her through the laning phase, she can be great, but she needs to meet a lot of conditions that are really difficult a lot of times, so I'm not a fan of her. Nami just has a really high skill ceiling, but the problem is that her payout is like relatively low compared to other champions in most cases. Plus, it leaves your opponents a lot of counterplay potential in a lot of cases. Outside of that, asking, maybe tackling some of the AP champions. So like Vel'Koz and Brand, why aren't those, A or S tier? I think the problem with these champions is a champion like Brand actually relatively doesn't do that much damage until, you complete your Leandries and Demonic nowadays. And for the most part, a lot of champions have a lot of healing and mobility. So it's hard to actually get scenarios where you have people clumped up so you can bounce off spells and deal a lot of damage. So a lot of his strength in terms of AoE damage isn't really there nearly as much as before. And since all the items, like I said before, like Leandries doesn't have HP attached to it, he struggled to actually have enough tankiness to really, be in the thick of things and actually deal damage. Outside of that, champions like Vel'Koz and Lux, etc., they just suffer from really long range problems. They're champions that can do a lot of damage if they're poking, you're positioning really well, etc., but one small mistake, everyone jumps on you, you die almost instantly. Plus, a champion like Lux especially has not really fared very well since the new itemization. She doesn't use any of the mythics really that great, and I don't really like having to build a mythic item to even start dealing damage. At least with champions like Swain and Zyra, they have like CC and roots that are a lot easier to hit and a lot shorter cooldown, whereas a champion like Lux, she doesn't really want to put a lot of points in the queue early, so her queue is relatively short, long cooldown, and it doesn't really travel nearly as far, so you can run into a lot of problems with that in that sense. So I'm just not a fan of it. Plus, she has actually ooming problems in the early stages too. And then maybe some other questions about things like, Rakan or Alistar, Morgana, etc. I think Morgana has a lot of potential to be good, but you have to pick her into very pristine and good choices. So you have to kind of see the support. It needs to be a melee support. Then Morgana, I think, raises to about an A. But since I think that there's going to be lots of buffs to mages and just ranged champions in general, I think that she's just not a good blind pick in a lot of cases. And then, Galio and Alistar just fall off the cliff because of the fact that they're just too light on damage. So if you're not able to basically 100-0 combo somebody, your champion just struggles a lot of the cases, and you tend to get outscaled and out-tanked by a lot of the bruiser-like champions that are currently being played. Viego, Set, Gnar, Gwen, the list kind of goes on with all the drain tanks that are kind of in the game. And then I think the champion like Rakan, without this really his bonus movement speed, just lacks engage tools, and when he's only peeling, his peel is actually kind of lackluster, and in a lot of cases I'd rather be a champion like Braum. So that kind of covers like a lot of the B tiers. I know I'm missing a couple of the champions, but quite honestly, I feel like champions like Braum, Tahm Kench, Taric, etc. are just like not even worth having a conversation about. They're just so ruined by the nerfs to their champions and the current itemization that they're just so bad that they're not even worth picking up. And then champions like, Set and Pantheon need to snowball too hard, and I think Zilean took a huge hit also with the Shurelya's nerfs, and I always felt that like for the most part, Zilean is really hard to lane. So even though he gives EXP to your lane, unless you're basically playing against an all-in lane or a lot of champions that want to isolate and kill one target at a time, he tends to fall off a cliff. And even though he gives a lot of movement speed, I'm just not a fan of him in the support role. He might be an okay mid laner in some cases, just because I think he does well with gold. Anyway, guys, that kind of breaks down a lot of what's going on for the next patch. So hopefully you found this helpful for you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment in the section below, and hit that bell and whistle, and I'll see you next time. Peace.